Hello, everyone. I'm Mike Harrow with Slower, and it's my privilege to invite a personal friend and a former peer, Bill Shetti, who heads up developer cloud advocacy at VMware.
Thanks, Mike. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm only a couple of presentations away from you and probably happy hour at this point, right? So let's make it fun. I run a group at VMware called Cloud Developer Advocacy, which is specifically focused on looking at problem sets and issues that occur in the public cloud environments. You know, when you go deploy an application, when you go run that environment, what are some of the issues that you actually face, from security to compliance and cost and governance? And it's not just about the operational issues, but also just even deploying and having to build the right application with the right services that need to interconnect with it. And how am I going to do that? Whether it's Kubernetes or whether it's regular virtual machines. You can find me on Twitter. And today we'll cover something we call continuous verification, and what that means, and we'll kind of work through that. And I'll give you a little bit of a demo, right? Won't be a real demo. I'll walk you through something that is running in a real environment that we have. But it really starts with the following concept and the thought process. The obvious right now is obviously things have changed from the application perspective, right? And I think over the last day and over the last year, et cetera, we've all been talking about Kubernetes and the fact that microservice architectures and based applications are taking over. They're more prevalent today, yet there's quite a bit of, I'd say, n-tiered architectures and applications that are still there. But as we kind of look at what applications and how they're built today, right, you get an understanding of the complexities of it. And it's not just about the different bits, but the variance that you have in an application, right? They're polyglot. They've got multiple types of databases, multiple types of mechanisms of actually going and pulling out information from it. And obviously, they're going to be running on multiple environments, i.e. multiple clouds. Kubernetes gives us one way of effectively trying to normalize some of that, but there's going to be a lot of cases where you're using a mix and match of containers and native services. At the end of the day, managing this sort of an application once it gets deployed is a harrowing nightmare, right? There's so many complex pieces that are constantly moving around, changing from a versioning, interconnectivity, and lots of testing that has to get done. And when you think about it in a multi-cloud world, the unit of measure is now this. It's the application. How well is this application going to run, right? You're no longer really worried about network, storage, compute, et cetera, but you're worried about the operations around making this diverse application actually run. And if we really think about that statement, an application is the unit of measure now that we are measuring everything with, then operations should be centered around, in my opinion, right, around our CI/CD pipelines, right? And because it is the vehicle for that deployment. Now, obviously, you're going to have some sort of CI/CD vehicles and components for deploying, let's say, parts of that environment, potentially pre-canning and pre-deploying it and getting that running. But effectively, from the time a developer pushes that code, the time the artifact is created, to the time it actually goes and gets put into staging and or into production, right, the pipeline is your process. And we're all fairly familiar with it. And however, this can be kind of our benefit or our bane of our existence, right? And it really depends on how well we manage this, right? And we're doing quite a bit of information. I think we had some talks today around the CI part and I think yesterday I heard some of the talks around doing a lot more testing around it and stuff. But there's a lot of day two based operations that are done sort of outside of this, right? And those are baseline operational checks. If we think about it, okay, there's this whole concept of shift left and the fact that we want developers to kind of take up a little more of that mantle with respect to doing testing inside of their code and more SaaS and DAST and everything else. However, if you think about the frequency of the changes that are occurring and the amount of times we got to push to production, it's ever increasing. And the pressures are great. And so people will take shortcuts, right? We want to save some time. And we're going to do our checks. And sometimes we'll do some pre-checks. And a lot of times we do these checks post. And these checks, are things like cost. Have I overrun my budget? Do I have enough capacity? Predictably, is there enough capacity over the next 6 months, right? Has security changed once the application is actually deployed? It's not about the security of the application or whether or not that has holes from a CV perspective, but whether or not the environment has actually changed. Think about Amazon, right? The amount of changes that are occurring on a daily basis is immense, right? And there's constant features coming in every day. And then obviously does performance change, right? Because there are tweaks and changes that are occurring in those services that you're using. Now we do these on a post-deployment perspective a lot of times. And what does that do? That effectively creates a whole set of work for us because we now have to go and potentially remediate that problem, right? Whether we have to add more capacity, go tune something down, potentially go back and redeploy it because something is not actually meeting a certain spec, et cetera. And that effectively kind of reduces efficiency, right, when it comes to operations. But what's ideal? So if we think of a automotive plant, a manufacturing plant, and how we build cars, right? If you think about when that car leaves the factory and the amount of cars that are produced today, quality is actually pretty high, right? We would love to have software deployments to be as high quality as they are when they come out of that factory. Okay, there's recalls, there's a whole bunch of other things. But in reality, if you think about it with the numbers that they're doing and the complexities of what that car is, it's fairly complex, just like an application, right? Obviously more complex in the application because of the moving parts, but the point is that as it leaves the factory, it is of high quality, and that's because there's a significant amount of process and repeatability that has been built into that process, right? So we'd love for this to effectively mimic that in our process, in our CI/CD process. And efficiency, if you think about that automotive pipeline, it comes from the fact that not only parts that are being reused, but tests that are being reused amongst multiple product lines, right? Multiple components and common components that are constantly being reused, which reduces obviously time of rebuilding and recreating things, but it increases that efficiency on a regular basis. And there's constant checks, right? Welding is done, somebody checks it, right? Seats are put in, somebody checks it. Steering's put in, et cetera, right? And if we start taking those concepts and we start applying it to operations in a multi-cloud environment, well, we have to go back to that CI/CD pipeline that I was telling you about I think is the main effective process element and control mechanism, right? And we generally think of that pipeline as the thing in green that, which I just highlighted. And that goes from, when an artifact is pushed in to the point where we do a multiple set of stages for whatever we need to do and the deployment gets done. However, if we take that analogy from a manufacturing plant, right, in the automotive industry, and we apply it now, we need to start adding checks into that pipeline, right, in the CD portion of it, in that continuous deployment portion of it. And those checks effectively can be anything you want it to be, right? Those checks are what you think are necessary to make sure that you don't have to make or to try to prevent remediation from occurring later on. I think the best way I put it is, as DevOps people, you want to reduce your mean time to happy hour, right? You don't want to be spending a lot of time fixing stuff later. So start putting checks in, right, that can help you, whatever that is. Okay, I listed a few here, and we'll go through a few today, right? This is a framework. It's a thought process, right? And that can be as simple as, going and making calls to external systems, building your own system, or doing a bunch of scripts, or whatever it is. But the checks are important. And that is what I call continuous verification. It's effectively taking day 2 based operational components and shifting them left into the CD portion of the CI/CD pipeline, okay? Now, it's sort of obvious, but I think it's something that we've sort of put out, and we want more and more of the DevOps operations models to start including this, right? It should help you. And what does it obviously lead to? Well, yeah, going to have more time to relax on that beach and have some fun, right? So what are some of those actors? What are some of those components that I could effectively go and connect to? Well, like I said, it really depends on what you need, and you have to think about your business. You have to think about your operations. You have to think about the applications, all the line of businesses, what they want, and what they need. And if you look at the ecosystem, there's a myriad of tools out there, right? A few categories that we've come up with that we constantly talk about are, number one, cost and utilization, right? And there's a bunch of tools out there that you can pick from, right? Compliance. It means many things, but there's lots of different components from retail to to open source bits. Security, right? You got things like Aqua, Claire, and image security. You can utilize authorization, access, and componentry. I mean, you can go straight into Amazon if you needed to, or use things like Turbot as an example. Performance, Datadog, or Wavefront. And I apologize, the graphics are a little bit off in here, but the ones in purple that are circled are the ones that obviously VMware kind of works with and or has built, right? And if we think about, okay, let's take a few of these, the ones that are in circle, and how do we apply that to a pipeline? Where would we apply it? Well, that also depends on where you want to apply it. I'll give you an example, right? And I'll actually go through a scenario here for you, and I'll show it to you in a running pipeline. But if we have this sort of a continuous verification scenario, right, we'll have a bunch of builds that go on. Those builds will create a set of artifacts. You're going to do your standard checks in there. You may do some functional tests beforehand, or maybe after. You'll definitely do some scanning, right? That's where Claire comes in, or something to that effect, and whatever kind of CV scanning tool that you want. Then you may want to do like a governance check. Hey, before I take those artifacts now and actually go into, let's say, my AKS cluster, which is a staging component, has a certain capacity, has a certain set of security components built into it, let's double check and make sure the project hasn't blown up, right? Let's make sure that the security is still in existence, and so on and so forth, right? So let me show you a couple of those tools and what that may look like. I'm just going to switch, and I'll switch back. Second. Okay. So here we have a sample pipeline, right, that I ran earlier today. And I built a service called Cart Service. It's out of an application that we built. It's similar to Hipster Shop or Weaveworks Sock Shop. It's called Acme Fitness, and you can find it on our GitHub page. Find me at my GitHub page. You'll find a link to it. But this is one of the services that that we have, and it gets built, it goes through, it's scanning, and it gets to this governance check. What does this governance check do, right? Well, let's just take a look at it. And if we pull this up, right, it basically calls a Python script that effectively does a test of whether or not the project is within a certain boundary limitations. Has it over limit, or has it hit the stretch? And there's a conditional statement that if it's over, right, exit. Or you can have it do something, right? If it's within budget, continue on, right? It's as simple as that. Now, what does this script actually do? The script actually calls an API to one of our tools, right, called Cloud Health. And Cloud Health actually is a cost management tool that actually helps you manage your costs on Amazon, Azure, and Google, and vSphere. And it gives you the breakdowns 5 ways to Sunday of everything that you are running for all the resources that are there, and you can cut that up by regions, by locations, by projects, by service type, etc. I can even, as an example, see what's running on my Kubernetes clusters on a per namespace basis. So as part of that check, in our example, I just did a simple project check for a total amount of capacity that's being utilized. But I can make a very specific call to say, hey, does this namespace for this specific Kubernetes cluster exceeding its CPU utilization that I don't want it to, or is there an issue, as an example, or I can make it as part of a cost query, right? So there's a lot of variance in what I can do with a cost and utilization sort of a check. And that's all up to you and what you think is important, right? But this is a simple API call, right? That goes and gets information, does a couple of analysis, and then says, yes, go ahead or end. Now, once I've done that, I also go in and I say, okay, let me just double check my security inside of that cluster, right? Or endpoint, right? Doesn't have to be a cluster. It can actually just be an Amazon environment or your hyperscaler environment. In this situation, right, it does the same thing. Use a Python script, makes an API call to a system that actually checks that environment and actually finds a violation. Okay, so what we did is we actually turned on port 22 as an example, right? And that's a big no-no. So that actually comes out as a violation in the system that we're using, which is Secure State, one of VMware's products, that actually checks all the violations that are potentially there in your multi-cloud environment. And we reverse the logic in this one so we can continue, right? And an example of this, and I'll just go through the product for a little bit quickly, right? It effectively goes in and actually has a full mapping of all the different objects that you have in Amazon and Azure, right? Has all the relationships. It actually keeps track of all the drift. What that means is it tells you when things are changing on those objects and the relationships. And then you set up a policy against that. You set up a compliance component. And then you can call an API and say, has this thing been violated? Now, there's standard things like port 22 is turned on, there's, RDS is not encrypted, et cetera. But to give you just a little bit of an example, right? If I look here, I have a little bit of a map of a security group violation that's there. It tells you the IP permissions and the objects there. And I get a ton of information about this. But this tool, Secure State, gives me the ability to get a set of information about all the different violations and potentially changes that are occurring in my multi-cloud environments, And then I'm just calling that inside of my pipeline on specific components that I want to check for, okay? So now I've done that, I may finally deploy to staging, right? And all right, we've done a simple deploy here, and that's a bunch of Kubernetes manifests that goes into a cluster and it just gets deployed. And an obvious one could be a performance check, right? We're running a locust traffic generator, and then we'll check performance. So here's another one that does exactly what the other two sort of did. In this case, runs a Go script and actually checks for a specific parameter of a metric. And I'll go to my favorite metric tool, and that's Wavefront. All right, it's a VMware tool. And here I can see a whole bunch of clusters that I'm utilizing. And I can change between the clusters, and I got some pretty graphs, right? But I can go and find specific bits and metrics and components that I want to check on. And in this situation here, we're checking on the pod's CPU usage, right, and what the rate of that usage is. And if it exceeds a certain limit, it says, no, sorry, based on running conditions for that application, I don't think this is ready for production at this point in time, right? Okay, so that's a good set of, a small little demo of just some examples, right, of how this can be implemented. What you pick and what you do, that's all up to you, all right? Okay, we've added some VMware components. Obviously, it would be great if you pick some of those. But I think you have to go back and figure out what that is. Now, if you think about the bits that I added, what that constitutes, right, is really thinking about coming up with a statement of I'll use the term, and I don't necessarily like it, but we'll say policy for right now, right? But it's effectively what I consider okay, right, as a compliance component and it's a governance component for that application or that project specifically to go forward. And when I think about this, right, how would I implement this, right? And I think the best way we think about this, and I'm going to go through an analogy of why this is important, because as you actually go through and start thinking about this, this last piece is just as important as thinking about that pipeline and where you add stuff, right? So I'm going to do an analogy, right? So Border Collie, okay, is a DevOps person, okay? And if you think about the Border Collie, and we think about what they have to manage, right? Manage sheep. You get 2 sheep, it's easy, right? Not a problem. It's nice and happy. A few more, I can manage this, not a problem, right? It's running around, kind of managing that. Hey, I've got all the rules, I can set this up. Generally, you get to this stage at some point in time, and it is chaos, right? And that becomes a nightmare, right? So even if you do add checks inside of your, let's say, your pipeline, you will get into a situation where you just have tons of apps that are occurring on a regular basis, right? And so the important piece here is that, what you want to do is, instead of just having sort of this controlled chaos that's constantly occurring, you want to create a sense of, and what we call it is fences and gates, right? For every single project, every single application, you create a sense of fences and gates that effectively you control. And where would you control it? You'll put it into, you create a policy that you would build. Maybe it's a JSON file, maybe it's a YAML file, whatever. You'll build that, you'll run through a process, you'll effectively go and put that back into Git and manage that from a constant change perspective, right? And as you find new things, you'll come back and you'll modify that. Why? Because things are changing in Amazon on a regular basis. So understanding your fences and gates, as we call it, right, or your policy is very important. And how you implement that is more important at some level than where you actually put it, right? Because those fences and gates are going to determine how successful that application deployment is, but really going to dictate how good your operations is going to be, right? And so, okay, we'll come back to this analogy. Instead of having a sad collie, we have a happy one, right? So fences and gates are important, or basically building, right, that policy statement and understanding what that policy is, right? So if I think about some of those checks that I made before in that pipeline, right, I just iterated through a few here, right? I mean, if I have security, I'm going to check out, hey, is my security group, have all the security groups, do they have port 22 turned on? Did that environment change? Or from a performance perspective, right, I'm going to check whether I have bottlenecks, do I have high latencies, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to codify this in some form or fashion, right? And so I think between the combination of actually understanding what you're going to use at a high level and then being able to codify this from a policy perspective and then implementing this is important. And this is, as we call it, it's a continuous process. It doesn't stop. I mean, you can't just build it, set it, and forget about it, right? Because you're going to constantly learn where there are changes and variations based on changes in application deployment, components that are being utilized, changes in Amazon, right, from a functional standpoint, et cetera, business policy, everything, right? So if I bring all this together, and I'm going to overlay some of the VMware components, right? I think the summary of this is that you wanted to, and we have a partner one here, which is Gitlab that we use, right? But effectively, all the things that you can do in day 2, bring it into CD, right? Into your pipeline, pick the things that you need. So everything in purple, right? And obviously some of those tools that we sell and a lot of people use from day 2, what we're saying is if you're going into a multi-cloud environment, you want to start adding some of those checks now inside of the CD pipeline. And then you're going to quantify that, you're going to codify it, and then you're going to consistently put those guardrails back into Git, and you're going to constantly be monitoring it and managing it on a regular basis. So hopefully you get to some kind of a cadence where you have more time and you actually get to some efficiency levels, right, over time. And that's continuous verification for you. So, okay. Thank you. Questions? Sure.
No, we appreciate it.
I try to give people an opportunity, but if there's just dead air, I can just talk forever because I'm in sales. Anyway, the question that I have is, this is really awesome stuff, and I love the concept of a continuous verification framework. But the customers that I talk to, which are the same customers that you talk to, it's great, but their fingers are super heavy. They don't want to lift them necessarily. It would be awesome if there would be a framework which is just for such and such of an application portfolio. So like a Bitnami this, Magento that, something else this.
Sure.
Click this button, and then it will print out a thing that says, yes, you are PCI DSS compliant.
Okay.
Are you building something like that, or do you know of a verification system that can essentially do the entire job of, let's say, a continuous auditor, just like out of the box and go from there? Because if you did, that'd be awesome.
So I think we have parts of it right now, right? But I think that's a great question. I think that's going to be done in different parts of that's going to be done in different parts of that pipeline, if we think about that again. So I showed you a tool that we have. It's called Secure State. It will definitely check from a PCI, HIPAA, CIS, whatever compliancy perspective, the environment, okay? So if you're an Amazon, Azure, or whatever, Google, you're going to understand whether or not that's compliant, okay, first and foremost. Then we come back to the application, okay? So yes, we have something called Bitnami, right? You guys are potentially familiar using Bitnami, so that's part of it's part of VMware now. And it has some of those checks, and part of Bitnami's actual value proposition is that you are using a curated image, right, that has been double checked and with minimal sort of CVEs and everything built in. Then we get into, okay, so that takes some burden off at that point, right? Now we get into your question about, okay, now the actual application, how do I check whether it's HIPAA, PCI, or other compliance, right? So that's something that we are working on to double check and maybe integrate it back into like the compliance checks we have in Secure State, right? So bits and pieces are coming out, but we're adding these components as best we can. A lot of this is also pattern match, right? And I think it's important to understand when and how we want to apply it, right? So as people are growing into the public cloud, right, everybody has a different way of doing things. And what we want to do is to provide the most flexible way of doing it. And what we're not trying to do is to say, oh, we have the ultimate tool that'll do it. No, right? So I think if we give you the bits and pieces where we can, you'll use them and maybe we'll find a better pattern. So right now we have probably 70% of what you asked for, right? We'll get there, right? And that may change, right? Who knows? So I think we're being very methodical about getting some of these pieces out. And look, there's ecosystem components too that you can add in, right? So if you look at that pipeline, if we don't have it, go use something else at the end of the day. But this is all up to you. So I think, yeah, I think that can be achieved now in some of the bits that even we have in other places. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.